Hello everyone, Amadorn here, and welcome to the Tangled Crossroads. Today I have a friend with me. He's also a dungeon master for a game that I play in. We just wrapped up a 3-year campaign here back in October, and we're getting ready to start on it. Would you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell people where you can be found?
Hey everyone, I am the Dungeon Meister. You can find me on YouTube at the Dungeon Meister 77. And as Amadorn said, I am a fellow Dungeon Master. I've been playing D&D for about 15 years, and most of that has been intertwined in some way, shape, or form together. So, happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining. Today we're going to be mostly talking about Session Zeros. Now, I just recently hosted my Session Zero for the campaign that I'm getting ready to run here in January that you're going to be playing in. And I know the opposite is true here later on this month. You're going to be hosting a Session Zero for a game that I'm going to be playing in.
Yup.
You know, when I was growing up, we really didn't do Session Zeros. We just kind of made characters and started playing. But as time has gone on, I feel like Session Zeros are more important. How do you feel about them?
Well, kind of like what you're saying with as time gone on, I really think the nature of Dungeons & Dragons has changed over the years. Especially in a more modern setting with, you know, the access that people have to, like, get information from the outside world with the internet and all the books and things that are available. There really has kind of unleashed the creative imaginations of people, you know, everywhere. And I think that plays a lot into the modern age Dungeons & Dragons, where it's less about just being a strict dungeon crawl and more about really putting yourself into the shoes of the character that you want to create and shaping a story around them.
Definitely, I can see that. You know, back when I was a kid, it was mostly, you know, how many monsters can you kill and how much treasure you can collect. And there really wasn't the emphasis.
Still talking about the game, or is this just going outside?
No, this is still a little bit of both. But yeah, you know, it wasn't really as much into the role play as we are. I mean, the game that we just wrapped up, that was a very heavy role play campaign. It was amazingly fun. We'll talk in a different episode about some of the crap that Theo got up to. But Session Zeros also help, at least in my opinion, help set expectations for the game. Have you felt that as well?
Yeah, it's definitely things that are important to get out of the way, like at the very beginning. And I say that in like terms of like figuring out the kind of setting that everybody is comfortable playing in. You know, you might have like a table of people who are all about the combat experience, and if you're planning on running a campaign that's all role play, and you know, you can go 3, 4, 5 sessions without combat. If you have a table that's full of combat expecting players, the session will probably crumble very quickly. And so not just setting, you know, the expectations for the course of the campaign, but also like what you can like expect from your players as the dungeon master and what your players can expect from you.
Right. Now, I put together a document that was based heavily on a document that you put out at the beginning of your last campaign that had player expectations, DM expectations, setting information and stuff like that. Are you planning to do that for your next?
Yeah. Since I kind of originally did that, pretty much all of my campaigns moving forward during Session Zeros will have a similar guideline. It'll be updated to fit, you know, whatever kind of world setting and however many players there are and what day of the week we play on. So like really minor adjustments to it, but I think the core of it is pretty solid and pretty universal. I feel like there could be anyone who could pick up this document and look at it and be like, this is a reasonable list of expectations for players and DMs.
Right. Now, I also play in a game that is on Twitch, that is streamed on Twitch by a DM that runs it. And she did a Session Zero as well. We actually streamed our Session Zero, which is the first time I've ever done that. But she also covered things like, because the setting of that game is set in Barovia with Curse of Strahd and stuff, there's a lot of gothic horror in there. There's some topics that could be considered, you know, disturbing by some people. So that was a topic that we discussed during the Session Zeros. You know, what are we comfortable with? Have you incorporated any of that into your play?
I think it's a big part of Session Zero is kind of establishing boundaries from, both a in-game character's perspective and a out-of-game, person perspective. You don't want to cover any topics that is going to make anyone feel, really uncomfortable. And so being able to sit together as players and DMs at the very beginning and talk and address all that stuff, it really goes a long way for shaping the course of the campaign, because I don't think there would be anything worse than, being in the middle of a session, maybe a year or so into a campaign, and then suddenly hitting a trigger point that, you may have incorporated as integral to your story, but now you may have like a player who is not comfortable with that, and now you have to kind of reshape everything. So Session Zero's
kind of helps set boundaries.
Yeah. Yep.
For other DMs and stuff, game masters out there, and obviously a Session Zero doesn't have to be strictly a D&D thing. It could be Pathfinder. Pretty much any tabletop RPG could use a Session Zero. What kind of advice would you give to other DMs who are planning on setting up a Session Zero?
I think it's important to make sure that the topics you cover in your Session Zero are kind of understood by everybody at the table. You really want to go into this on a very neutral setting. You want to make sure that, everyone knows that this is a kind of open discussion where, the things on your Session Zero itinerary are, subject to change in terms of, like, if your expectations are that everybody be here at a certain time and a player can't make it at that time, that is a good time to establish, okay, well, what can we do? I want to start at 4, you can't be here till 5, can everyone else make it at 5? Everyone's here to talk about it.
Right.
So just making sure that everyone knows that a Session Zero is a fantastic opportunity for their voices to be heard at the very start. That way, if they do have anything like schedule complications or anything like that, it can be worked and sorted out at the very beginning, as opposed to having to, do it at the start of Session 1.
Right, and along those lines, you can also talk about optional rules, house rules, kind of clarify those things as well during the Session Zero, and decide which ones you're going to use. Because I know, like, the Player's Handbook and the DM's Guide do have some optional rules in the back. Of course, we're both, we've both watched a lot of Critical Roles, so we've picked up some stuff from there as well. I think we both use some sort of version of Matt Mercer's Death Resurrection rolls. And I kind of, the idea of using healing potions either as an action or a bonus action, and depending on whether or not you roll the dice or take the max, I think we both picked up. I picked that up from you, and I don't know where you picked that up at.
I picked that up from a YouTube video.
Oh,
yeah. Somewhere out there, there's like a video that's like best homebrew or house rules kind of thing, and that was one of them that I had seen that kind of stuck with me.
Do you watch any of Matt Colville's stuff?
I have in the past. I've seen very little of his actual campaigns that he runs, but I've seen a lot of his kind of guide and tip videos that he's put out over the years, where how to be a better dungeon master, how to be a better player, things like that.
I definitely have watched most of that series, the Chain of Acheron series, where he actually ran a group. I watched through it, and I thought it was a pretty good campaign. Now, in the Session Zero that I just ran here recently, we also rolled for stats and base. I mean, everybody came to the table kind of with character ideas and stuff, but we hadn't rolled for stats and made the actual characters. Is that something we're planning on doing for yours?
Yeah. Yep. I think Session Zero is a good time to do that, because it is a great way to keep everybody honest, where you roll your stat dice in front of everybody else, so that if you get insanely high stats, you have the proof. You guys don't know it, but Amadorn's dice are absolutely loaded.
They are not loaded.
They are super loaded.
They are not loaded.
Why don't we just go through it real quick? What are your most recent stats that you rolled?
Okay, well, let me pull up Adric here, because he's the one that we rolled as the character for... Because in my campaign, since we've only got 4 players, we're going to be having a GM character. So Adric is a dwarf, okay? So after his bonuses for being a dwarf, he ended up with a 15 strength, 14 dexterity, 18 constitution, 14 intelligence, 18 wisdom, and an 8 charisma.
And that's, I want to also interject, that's after he had stat scores taken from him.
Yeah.
Because some other of us, like me, didn't have the best stat arrangements when we rolled. And so his stats were so high that he said, just pick one of mine to take a -2 from and just add it to one of yours. So 2 of us did that. So that's his stat score after an effective -4 was taken away from him. So he claims his dice aren't loaded, but I just don't buy it.
They're not. They're not loaded. But I will say on 4d6, dropping the lowest, the average is probably about 13 to 14.
I would agree.
They're just really good dice. Also, during the session 0 that we did some character backstory information. Not a lot, but we were able to kind of tie settings to characters a little bit, and also a couple of the players were able to make connections between their 2 characters during my session 0. Kind of hoping to see that in the session 0 coming up for you as well. I kind of have an idea what kind of a character I'm going to play. You know, with that, the session 0 can kind of build a camaraderie between the players and the characters, and kind of give the group a reason to exist. How did that work out in the previous campaign that we played? Because I know we did a session 0 there.
We had a session 0 where everyone had kind of brought in their character ideas, but the character ideas, like, by the time they came to the table, they were pretty already almost set in stone, with everybody having a very good idea of what they were going to play. Everybody was kind of individualized from each other in terms of, like, you know, where they were from in the world and things like that. And so the start of the campaign actually was kind of a little rough. It took a little bit for everyone to kind of get on the same page, but
of course, we all started at a tavern.
Yeah, the classic tavern start. So even though in the tavern, like, the group was forced together, you know, quote unquote forced, it still took a little bit for the characters themselves to kind of warm up to one another. And I think something that I didn't do in session 0 last time that I might not necessarily encourage but remind people that it is an option if you wish to do it, is that your characters do not have to be strangers going into the session. You know, whether it's a very loose relation, at least to the point of, like, yeah, I know this, I've heard of this person, we can trust them kind of thing. I think starting like that with, like, a sense of a very, very basic level of trust, so that it kind of skips the early parts, may be beneficial to some, but, you know, maybe not. That's not for everyone. Maybe the kind of initial distrust and everything, you know, kind of going back to Critical Role. Critical Role's campaign 2 started off the same way, where a lot of their characters didn't really trust each other in the beginning, but then, you know, by the end of it, everybody came together. Versus, like, their campaign 1, where a lot of them were pretty good friends at the very start. So it's just kind of, you know, different settings and different worlds will cause for different things.
It was kind of interesting in the last campaign where, you know, because yeah, we started in a traditional tavern. We had this encounter with this creature that ended up putting a mark on us that we all had to kind of figure out how to deal with. We were all basically strangers to each other, you know, had our own stories of how we ended up in this tavern at the same time, but there was a lot of friction in the group that kind of had some interesting character moments throughout the campaign. And I also really remember that while our game lasted about 3 years in real time, in game terms, I think we only covered maybe four or 5 months in game, which was really kind of interesting and weird. The time compression of a game. But
and that's something like that. Like, me as a dungeon master is, like, I'm still working on and struggling with like time advancement, because, you know, it's hard to look at a picture of a map and be like, how long does it take to get from city to city? You know, you might ballpark, you know, like 2 weeks to go from this town to this town. Then, like, you think about it, it's like, how many miles are you covering in a day, and how many miles is it from this town to this town? And it's like, if we were to walk from where we are now, an hour away to our state capital, like, how long would that take?
To walk it, probably a day or two, at most.
But then you think about, well, then what if I'm going clear across the United States?
Yeah.
Because that's a lot of times, like, when you look at a map, like, the maps are often condensed, but it's a chunk of land, it's a continent itself. And a lot of times you'll go from, like, one end of the continent to the middle, and it's like, could you do that in 2 weeks? Like, I have no idea. I'm really bad at, like, time management in that regard.
Well, I mean, I remember reading, like, some old books about the Oregon Trail and stuff like that, and I think that trip was, like, from St. Louis to Oregon back in the 1800s was, like, 6 months. Of course, you're crossing the Rocky Mountains and everything, and you're having to stop, and you're probably only doing a few miles a day because you're only moving as fast as the slowest person in your group. There was a few steampunk type elements in your world as well, because you have airships and you have trains, or magically powered trains. I don't remember us ever actually using one. But
you didn't. You never took the trains.
We did use the airships a couple of times.
You did. You used an airship once, and you brought home a butler.
Well, we needed it for the new keep. So we've kind of talked about, triggers, sensitive topics, creating characters. What other things do you feel like house rules? We've talked about that a little bit. What other things within a session 0 do you feel like are good to include?
A little bit of knowledge about the setting you're going to be playing in. Like, for me, a big part of my session 0s is, not only just listening to what everybody has to say about, what characters they plan on bringing to the table and things like that, but it's also being, like, your first opportunity as a dungeon master to introduce this part of your world to the players. Or if you're running from a campaign from a book, it's an opportunity for you to kind of set the bar for your players as to your understanding of the world you're about to step into, whether it's your own homebrew world or you're playing from a book. Not everybody is going to know. If you are playing from a book, not everybody's heard of the book before. They might not understand what Barovia is if you're playing Strahd.
Right.
If you're playing a homebrew world, obviously they're not going to have no idea about what they're stepping into. And so establishing a little bit of lore and background about the setting that you're going to be playing in, I feel like, is also a very important part of Session 0, because that will also help them. I encourage people to come to the table with character ideas, but I typically tell them to hold off on their backstory until after Session 0, because then they'll have a full understanding, or at least a better understanding of the setting they're going to be in, and they can kind of pick, look at a map and be like, I think my character would be suited, best suited to be from these mountains, or this forest, or this city. Things like that. And then once they decide where they're going to be from, then you have an opportunity to work, closer with them and be like, okay, well, you're from here. These are things that you would know about your region, your starting region.
Now, I know in the last campaign, when I was making Theo, I wrote the backstory for him, and I even created, the little village that he was from, which I still can't pronounce. Thank you, random fantasy name generator with Greek as the name.
The name generator gave us some glorious names.
Yeah, it did.
All hail the butt touch.
And the Big Blow. Those were some pretty good names, which are great names for ships. Yeah. But yeah, I basically made all of this with really only having seen your map and not really having a whole lot of background information, because I don't think we hadn't really had the Session 0 when I made Theo's backstory. I don't think. I know we're both using homebrew worlds. The game coming up is set on the same world as the one that we played in, but a different continent. I know I'm playing a Gemstone Dragonborn, and I think one of the other players is also going to be playing a Dragonborn of some kind, but I'm not sure what. is that going to play into the setting? I know I'm kind of poking for hints at the world a little bit.
Fishing for clues.
I am a little bit.
The setting of the world, like, will that affect the continent? The kind of beauty of it is, it might. Depending on what you make in your backstory, I often take a lot of inspiration from player backstory to include in the world, kind of like what we did with Theo, where you made a village and we just kind of fit it somewhere where it made sense to be. Mm-hmm. I didn't originally plan for that place to be there, but, it was in your backstory, and so there it went. And the same thing is true, for future campaigns. If you decide that, you want to make a gemstone city of some kind, maybe it does play a big part in it. But as
see if I can make it pronounceable next time.
Well, if you can, I will. But as far as the setting of the world, I don't think in that regard it'll change too much. However, the dynamic of the world is a totally different story. Obviously you'll know more once the campaign starts, but the inclusion of, you guys wanting to play Dragonborns, I think will have a larger scale effect than perhaps you may realize it right now.
I don't think we have decided whether or not our characters know each other, but I suspect we will. Going back to kind of building that sense of camaraderie, or at least familiarity between characters within a group that's going to be playing together. We're not starting at level 1. We started at level 3 for your previous campaign. We're starting at level 3 for the campaign that I'm running, and I think you've mentioned that we're going to be starting at level 3. I know pretty much everybody at our table is pretty well experienced as far as play goes. Do you feel like that's a good place to start? Have you wanted to start at level 1 with a campaign, or even a higher level later on at some point in a campaign?
I think that it really depends on your players at your table. Like you mentioned, our players are pretty experienced, and so I think with experienced groups of players, I think level 3 is a fantastic starting point, because most of the time when you create a character, you have this vision of them already in your head. If you plan in their backstory that they are, are training to be an assassin, or they're already an assassin, it feels really weird to make a backstory about being an assassin and then you start at level 1 and you're not really an assassin yet. You're still working your way there. But starting at level 3 gives every class access to their archetype. Like, what sub-archetype are you? So if you make a backstory about being an assassin, you start at level 3, you're an assassin rogue already. Same thing with, a thief or whatever it is you want to be. However, in addition to what I run here with you guys, experienced players, I've recently started running for a group of inexperienced players, and none of them have ever touched D&D before. There was one person who has kind of played a little bit when they were in high school, but everybody else was brand new. And I think in a setting like that, level 1 is almost a necessity that you have to start at, because they don't know anything. And I think to drop, a level 3 start on somebody who has 0 experience would just be so confusing and potentially overwhelming. It could ruin their whole, experience of the game.
Right. Now, in the game that I play in on Twitch, I'm one of 2 experienced players in a group of 5 players, 3 of which who have basically played very little D&D before. And so we did start at level 1, but at the end of the first play session, we actually leveled up to level 2, and then like a couple of sessions later, level 3. But those first couple of levels were really meant to kind of give those new players the opportunities to kind of learn how to play, how to look at their characters, how to read their character information, because you really want your players at the table to really kind of understand their characters as they're playing, because if they don't, if they're looking through the book all the time, it kind of slows down play, especially in combat. Combat can take forever. Of course, last campaign we had combats that lasted what? The fight with the matron was like almost 3 sessions.
3 sessions, yeah.
Yeah. and then the ultimate one there at the end of the campaign, that was 2 sessions, but
It was 2 sessions against the actual big bad, but kind of the finale trigger with the first fight. I would say it probably, the final part of the campaign that like kind of signaled the end was probably the first fight against Gil, and I think his fight took a couple sessions, and then the Hound Hydra, the finale, took another couple sessions. Yeah. So even though they were different fights, it was all part of the same kind of ending theme, and so that took 4 sessions to get through.
Plus we had like 2 sessions before where we were doing kind of a mass combat thing across the entire continent because of the invasion that was going on at the time. So really the end of the campaign was what, 6 combat sessions?
Yeah, I think it took us about a month and a half from the point where everyone was like, this is it, this is the beginning of the end. I think it took us about a month and a half, real time to get through it all.
Right. And if we had started at level 1, we'd probably still be playing, to be honest.
Get started at level 1, maybe my tower would still be there.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Low blow.
Well, we'll talk about that in another episode. Yeah. That was an explosive encounter. So in both of our campaigns, I think we've chosen to do milestone leveling as opposed to XP leveling. What was your emphasis for making that decision?
I feel like milestone, like to me personally, milestone leveling just feels more rewarding. Where after you have concluded like either a large arc or have bested a very strong opponent, being able to be rewarded with a level up or something of that nature, like it just feels more satisfying to me as a player, and it allows for more like natural progression through a campaign where the dungeon master can kind of set the pace of it. If you are planning on playing a long-term campaign, you can slow the early levels down a little bit. If you're wanting to play like a quicker paced campaign, you can kind of expedite the later levels. Because when you level through EXP, by the time you get to like level 8 or so, levels after 10 really become a challenge. You can fight things of like a CR like 20 and split up the XP between 5 people and have put maybe 10% of a dent into the way to level 11. And so that to me is just, it feels unrewarding and can really take the excitement out of the later levels of a campaign.
Yeah. I agree with that for the most part. I do. My reasoning for not using XP over milestone is I just don't want to deal with the with
the calculations
with the math that you have to deal with in order to keep XP. So I've pretty much just for ease of story, it really. Now XP does have good sides as far as like, if you're playing in a campaign and maybe characters are kind of switching out from time to time, so some characters might be at different levels within the story, and that can cause kind of its own sorts of interactions. So I can see some advantages to using XP at times, but for myself, and I think for you, it's really just for story purposes, it just feels better to do milestones.
And that's another thing that's kind of like one of the things that's addressed in a session 0 setting is, what does everybody feel comfortable with? The DM can choose their preferred style, and if all the players are cool with it, then, that establishes that expectation right away at the beginning, because then the players know that they also don't have to keep track of their XP.
Right. But one disadvantage of using milestones is sometimes the levels don't quite match where you're wanting the powers of the big beds to be. I know that towards the end of the last campaign, we ended up jumping 2 levels.
Late levels.
Yeah. Because we were, level 18 at the end? But we jumped from, 16 to 18. So is that something that you have run into with milestones a little bit more frequently, is not being able to keep up with?
A little bit. A lot of milestone depends on the pacing of the campaign, and for this most recent one, the end game kind of took off, like skyrocketed unexpectedly.
There were a couple of acceleration points.
There were, you know, at the right before we kind of entered into this final conclusion. I think you guys were around like level 14. And initially, like, I had still, like, another couple large arcs for you guys to go through before actually triggering the finale. But just the way the story went, and the way the dice worked, and the way that everything happened, the ending came much faster than really any of us were expecting it to. And I always like to take, you know, if we're going for a long-term endgame campaign, I always like to take my players to a minimum level of 17, because 17 is when all your big casters get their 9th level spells. And, you know, who doesn't want to toy around with 9th level magic?
Absolutely.
Exactly. You know, it doesn't really matter what casting class you are, 9th level is a pretty big level.
Yeah. And they say a lot of campaigns hardly ever get past, like, level 10 or 11.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely nice to be able to get up into those higher levels.
And yeah, and so we weren't at the point where I had expected or thought you guys to be when the finale started unfolding, and so we did jump a few levels very quickly just to kind of get you guys to those big power levels, so you'd have at least 1 or 2 sessions to kind of play with it, you know, before the campaign wrapped.
Are you looking at any sort of tools or ways to kind of monitor that in your upcoming campaign, so that we? I mean, there's always going to be the unpredictable character that does strange things. But,
it's going to be, you know, for me, it's going to be a challenge next campaign, because this one that we just finished, with it going for about 3 years, is my longest I've ever run, and I think the longest a lot of people have been a part of, that at least we played with at our table. And I definitely think by the end of year 3, you know, pretty much all around, everyone was starting to feel the wear of it, you know. Not necessarily because they didn't like it anymore, they weren't having fun, but it was just, we all knew we were getting to the end, and just kind of ready to wrap things up. And so going into this next one, for me, trying to keep things kind of restricted to around a 2-year time frame is kind of what I'm going to shoot for. Whether, you know, I don't exactly know how we're going to do that yet. I'm kind of looking at, like, pacing tips from various resources that kind of help, you know, navigate getting through the course of a campaign. But
and since we're going to be playing basically 2 campaigns side by side, you know, I'm running one that you're playing in, and I'm going to be playing in one that you're running. I'm trying to keep it about the same pace. So, yeah, it'll be kind of interesting to see how the 2 campaigns kind of play out.
So is this permission that if you start blowing my stuff up again, I am legally allowed to blow up your stuff?
Well, stranger things have happened. I can always make a new world. We haven't actually blown up any planets, although we did blow up a mountain in that last campaign.
Yes, you did. You guys blew up a lot of things.
So overall, I feel like Session Zeros are pretty important. They help you set boundaries, they help you set ground rules, give out setting information, character creation, where people can kind of work together to make their characters as a group, and kind of give reasons for why their characters are going to be together, if it isn't something that is story-based, like it was for your last campaign, where nobody knew each other, but there was a story reason for us to be together. Is there anything that we're missing?
I don't think so. I think that kind of covers, like, the general, like, on a surface level of, like, why Session Zeros are you know, pretty important, and why they could be included in almost, you know, any kind of RPG setting.
Yeah, I really feel like there are some games out there like Vampire the Masquerade could really use a session 0 because that game can get pretty weird at times. You know, especially with characters being at odds with each other a lot more in Vampire. DCC kind of builds its session 0 into its mechanics with the funnel. You know, we've got another DM who ran a funnel for us for DCC on Monday nights, where everybody starts with 4 characters. You roll your dice at the table, and I ended up having 3 of my characters die during session 0. And then my 4th character in the last session that we played, my 4th character from the funnel died, so I've had to make new ones. So I think there's 5 or 6 of us in that game, and I'm the only one who has lost all of our starting characters.
Classic.
Might be a little bit reckless. But overall, I mean, Session Zeros seem to be able to create a good foundation for a campaign, and I think it's a lot of the reason why your campaign lasted the way it did. The fact that we were able to have 3 years of awesome adventures was based off of the Session Zero and the story that followed. I see D&D as group storytelling. It's everybody sitting around telling a story together, reacting to, you know, kind of like an improv session, and the dice and the rules of the game are just kind of there as guidelines. I see that a lot. We've got good foundations for the campaigns that we're going to be doing going forward. I'm looking forward to the Session Zero for your next campaign. See how much trouble I can cause.
You start causing trouble before the game starts, then we're going to start having issues.
But overall, I think we've got a good setup. So I think that is about all the time we have for this session, for this episode, the very first episode of the Tangled Crossroads podcast. Thank you for stopping by and
thanks for having
being a part of this.
Be glad to come back.
Yep. And until next time, everybody have a good day, and we'll see you. Goodbye.